Hello and welcome to Channel's Book Club. My name is Olaosebikan and it's exciting to be in the new year, 2023. Wow. When you look back at 2022, what a year it was, really. What a year. Every year comes with its own challenges. You've got your disappointments and those failings and those things you are not happy about generally. But, you also thank God for all the good things that happen, all the simple things that we don't appreciate God for many times. Family and good health and the air we breathe and the country we live in, despite all its many challenges and so many things. Freedom. So many good things to be grateful for. Well, this is 2023, and I hope and pray that it will be a much better year for you, that you'll be more prosperous and that your ways will be smoother than last year and that you have more successes and more good things to be grateful for. Well, that's my prayer for you. Well, let's get into 2023 now. We've got two writers on the show today, and both of them are not Nigerians. We've got a South African writer and a Kenyan writer on the show today, and they're going to be reading from their exciting books to us. And look, Africa is blessed with many great writers, from South Africa to Kenya to Zimbabwe to Nigeria, Ghana, so many exciting writers across the continent. And it's always a privilege to bump into one or two of them once in a while and get them to speak about their writing and their passion and to read from their books, just as we have today. Our first writer is Tim Cox from South Africa. Enjoy this.
Hello, my name is Tim Cox, and I am the author of Lagos, Supernatural City, an intimate portrait of Africa's biggest megacity. I was the Nigeria bureau chief for Reuters back in 2011 until 2015. And after that, I took a bit of time out to research this book, and I was then the bureau chief for West and Central Africa for Reuters, based in Dakar. I now live in Johannesburg. So this book is being published sort of 7 or so years since I actually left Lagos. I'm back here just to talk a little bit about the book, to tell Lagosians about it, because obviously it's about this city. It felt like the sort of the polite thing to do, to come back and showcase it. So let me speak a little bit about the book. Basically, it's about it tries to capture the soul of the city. It tries to understand what makes it tick and how people manage to navigate what is often quite a difficult place. I remember when I sort of thought maybe there was an idea for a book here was when I was stuck in traffic on the Third Mainland Bridge, and there was noise and there was hooting and there was a guy selling yams in the window. People were getting bad-tempered. It was one of those rush hour Monday morning, everyone's in a bad mood. And I just remember thinking, how do people do it? I live here, but I have a relatively easy life compared to a lot of people. So how do people put up with this day in, day out? And it took me a while to find the answer, but I realized the real answer is faith. That Lagos is a very spiritual place. It's a place where people have belief in higher powers, and this belief, the idea is that by surrendering yourself to these higher powers, whether this is your Christian God or Muslim God or more traditional polytheist religion, whatever it is that gives you this consolation and this sense of spirituality, this sense of I'm a part of a higher purpose, something bigger than myself. That is what enables you to cope with the level of uncertainty and risk and just the kind of day in, day out grind, the hassles of Lagos. And so I realized very soon that it had to be about that. It had to be telling the story of Lagos through the spiritual lives of people who live in the city, basically. So I chose 6 characters, and the idea was to really get under the skin of their lives, right? And it was very important to me to tell the story of Lagos in a more sympathetic way than it is often told by outsiders, right? And I think Lagosians sometimes bristle at people coming in here for a couple of weeks and then criticizing the place, saying, oh, it's corrupt, or it's dysfunctional, or oh, you can't get anything done. And I think it annoys people that no one tries to really understand what makes the city tick and why it is the way it is, because there's a whole history there. It wasn't a creation of Nigerians ultimately. It was founded by Nigerians, but it didn't become the city it did only because of Nigerians. It was created by pressures, by outside forces. And so you really have to go in deep to try and understand why the city is the way it is. And I wanted to try and show that actually you know, it's a balancing act, right? You want to show that kind of, that charm, that energy, that magic that makes Lagos so attractive, so likable to people, but also not flinch away from the things that make Lagos very difficult, like the inequality, the, you know, extortion by police or by area boys, and to try and sort of bring this together in a way that shows, yes, Lagos is a tough place, but it's also quite a magical place. And that was what sort of set me off working on the book. My favorite character, I don't know. The one I put at the beginning, the one I was most tempted by, was this character who is a tout in Obalende bus terminus. And she's a female street fighter, basically beating up these bus drivers for extortion, for money. Now, this sounds like a terrible person, right? But actually you start to realize as you go into her life why she's had to choose this very difficult way of life, because she didn't really have many options. Her husband abandoned her with 3 children and just left, just disappeared without a phone call, without saying where he was going. And then she basically is in this situation where, well, I've got to try and survive. I've got to bring up these 3 children and provide for them. And the only world she knew was the boys in the bus park. So she joined, and she's a tough lady. You know, she was tough. She was in boxing tournaments at school. She's not someone you want to mess with, basically. But she also, the more I got to know her, the more I found she had this kind of soft-hearted side. So I thought, there's something else here. And she sort of semi-retired. I don't want to give too much of the story away, but Islam plays a big part, and she's a Yoruba Muslim, and she has this very mystical Sufi faith, and this starts to have an impact on her thinking about her life in the garage and whether it's really the kind of life she wants to lead. So that was probably one of my favorites, and I put her at the beginning. And initially there was some concern from the agent that she's not a very sympathetic character because she's this kind of thug, basically. But when you read through what her life is and how she thinks, you realise that actually she is a sympathetic character. There's a sort of kind-heartedness underneath it, which comes through more and more as you go through the chapter. Maybe I will just start with hers, because it's kind of a nice intro to the book. So it's a scene where she is. It starts with a scene where she's beating up a bus driver. Blood was spattered all over the road. Some of it had already started to congeal in the Lagos heat into little black dots. It was coming from a bus driver being punched and kicked repeatedly by the touts outside Obalende bus terminus. Toyin relished the variety of sounds the victim was making: a whiny yelp, the guttural sound of his wind being knocked out, the faint crack of his ribs on impact. She pulled her boot back to get momentum and swung it into his torso. The driver deserved it, to be sure. The city bus he was driving was an affront to the Obalende boys, the gang that ran the busiest bus station on the 3 islands of Lagos. Most Lagosians used the creaky old yellow minibuses that plied much of the city, from which Toyin's gang extorted handsome sums of money. But these shinier white buses, owned by a businessman with links to the governor, were supposed to be off limits to the touts. The gangs had been warned to leave them alone, so their emboldened drivers were refusing to pay their loading fees. They had to be taught a lesson. Other gang members were smashing the bus's windows with nail-studded clubs and letting air out of its tires. By now, the sun was just up, bathing Lagos in a mellow light ahead of the steamy harshness that kicks in around 9. Obalende is a typically apocalyptic Lagos cityscape, a postmodern jumble of flyovers, bridges, cloverleafs and motorways with high-rises poking up between them that forms the main valve in the city's clogged heart. Ramps rise and descend, carving up spaces stuffed with crumbling, half-abandoned high-rises, concrete shacks blackened with soot, sagging power lines and gable-roofed apartment blocks. Toy knew almost every street and its regular inhabitants, down to the lowliest hawker. Ever since she was a girl, she had loved what she called the rugged life, fighting and hustling on the streets of Lagos. It was much more rewarding than sitting around looking pretty so that a boy would lavish money on her. With her slump-shouldered physique and round belly, Toyin would have stood out from the mostly wiry young men beating up the bus driver on that day. But her bulging biceps were ample warning that she was as tough as any. And then I start to talk about all these associations and the different. You've got the Automobile Technicians Association, the Food Vendors Association, the Witches and Wizards Association. How they all form this kind of racket where there's a person at the top who gets the biggest share of the money, and then I start to talk about how Oberlande was the sort of the one of the main transport rackets because it's such a vital sort of location for people coming from the mainland to the island. So I say, thanks to its strategic location, Oberlande was one of the biggest such transport rackets. It lies about 4 kilometers down a flyover joining the third mainland bridge, that bleak structure connecting Lagos's 3 main islands with Africa. Every weekday, millions of Lagosians pour out of the continental Lagos mainland, where most of them live, and cross one of 3 bridges to come and work on the islands, and then go back again. So one thing I want to stress is with this, as much as I love this character from the garage, from the bus park, by picking her out, I might be slightly skewing the perception of the book and of Lagos to make it seem like it's a particularly violent place and that I'm only focusing on the rough parts of Lagos. That definitely isn't true. And in fact, I've got characters from all walks of life, including an oil executive, where the story is about how she made a huge bet after a prophecy from her Pentecostal pastor. And there's absolutely no violence in that story. And I think it's important to stress that because although there is violence in the book, because that makes an interesting story, I don't think, and I said this at the beginning, that Lagos is a particularly violent city. It's much less violent, in fact, than many American cities, for instance. And it's certainly less violent than the one I live in at the moment, which is Johannesburg. And in fact, if you given all the frustrations that people have and the number of people who are all squeezed together in this city, it's astonishing how well people get on with each other, actually. And I think that's one of the things that comes out in the book, is that it's a very tolerant city. It's a city where so many Christians, I can't think of anywhere where so many Christians and Muslims could live side by side in such more or less perfect peace and harmony. So yes, there are traffic arguments and there are gangs and there's armed robbers every now and then, but I really was careful not to try and portray Lagos as a kind of particularly rough place. Yes, it has rough aspects, but what city doesn't?
I hope you enjoyed that. We'll have Tim with us one of these days on the show live. I look forward to that. Tim is such a gifted writer and journalist. Well, before we go to our next writer, we'd like to take you down memory lane a little bit more. 2022, we showed you some of the things that we did in 2022, some of the interviews we had and some of the events we covered in 2022. But let's show you a bit more of that before we get into our next writer on the show today. Enjoy this.
Fertile laws. I was curious. Fertile laws. I sort of suspected that you probably arranged the laws in the order of importance.
Yes,
so
yes.
I was curious to know which will be the first one.
Yes.
So when I saw the law of oxygen,
Yes.
and respiratory health. I said,
Yes. Yeah.
But, I mean, running through, you have the law of oxygen and respiratory health, the law of water and adequate hydration, law of nutrition and healthy foods,
Yes.
law of healthy heart and good circulation, law of immunity and vaccination, law of prevention, law of healthy environment, and so on. That, I mean, affects you, of course. But law of oxygen, it's the first law
It is. It is.
of good health.
Yeah. It's the most important law really for health and for living and for life. The first thing that happened to us is when a child is born is to take a breath.
And we keep breathing.
And we keep breathing. Even when you are asleep, you are breathing.
And when we stop, that's the end.
And that's the end. So it's the most important, and we must be serious about it. We must learn how to breathe properly. We must learn how to breathe deeply. We must also learn to breathe clean air, fresh air.
More of that to come in 2023. Well, as promised, let's go to our next writer, the very talented Kenyan writer, Wanjiru Koinange. Enjoy this.
My name is Wanjiru Koinange. I'm an author, the author of The Havoc of Choice, which is now available in Nigeria. I'm also a restorer of libraries in Nairobi, Kenya. The title of my book is The Havoc of Choice, and it tells the story of Kenya's experience of a really recent election. In 2007, we had the worst election we've had since independence, where when two rival parties were running for government, for presidency, when the results were announced, the country completely erupted into violence. It felt spontaneous. It felt very, very strange for this to be happening in Kenya. But what was even stranger is how quickly we moved on from the violence after after several days of just killing and people getting displaced. All of a sudden, there was a vision of a handshake between the rival party leaders on TV, and everybody was told to go back to work, and we did, with no acknowledgement of all the loss and all of the pain. And I think what's happening now is that in Kenya, every time we have elections, we go back into trauma, we go back into PTSD, because we haven't dealt with what happened in 2007. And my book reminds Kenyans what those days were like, and kind of cautions us to ask ourselves, how can this happen, and how can we avoid it from happening again? So in Nairobi, Kenya, we have tons of libraries that have been built. They're open, but they're not really they haven't really been maintained very well by the local authorities. So I am one of two founders of an organization called Book Bank, and what Book Bank does is that we adopt public libraries and we transform them into what we like to call palaces for the people. Places where people can come and do what a library does, which is provide access to like space to do your studies and your academics, but also to explore art and in all of its glory. You can watch a film screening, you can catch up some theater productions, you can just sit and have a conversation with somebody. So we have 3 libraries in Nairobi at the moment. We've renovated 2 fully, and we're now going into the season where we renovate Nairobi's oldest library, which is the Macmillan Memorial Library. And for me, this work speaks so much to my work as a writer, because the books that I write have to live in these spaces forever. So it's also about creating the stories, but building the homes where these stories live as well. The section of the book I'd like to share is towards the end of the book, and it's a very powerful conversation between Kavata, who is one of the lead characters of the book, and her driver's wife. What happens is that, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, but Kavata has been raised in a political family all of her life. And so when her husband decides to run for office, she sees this as a betrayal, because she was trying to run away from the legacy of her father's political campaign or political career, and now has her husband chasing politics. So she leaves him. But when the violence happens, she has to find her way back home. And the way that the book is set up is that you follow 5 or 6 different characters who went to different parts of the country in Kenya, and through their journeys back to Nairobi, you're able to see what happened in different parts of the country. And this particular conversation is about privilege and about the things that happen when you don't consider other people in your choices, and the havoc of choices, basically. And I'm happy to share that now. So I'm reading from page 347 and I'll go on until around page 350, 349. Chepto was resting on the side of the road, peeling off the bandages that were on the side of her face. They were moist and ugly and did nothing for their cause. Kavata gasped when she saw how badly Chepto's face was injured. She went over to help her to clean the bandages. "What happened, Chepto?" Kavata tried to ask one last time, this time in Kikuyu. There was a long silence before Chepto spoke, starting with the day after Kavata left. She had begged Thuo to tell the police what he knew about Kavata's disappearance, and when he refused to speak, even when he was being called a criminal, she went through the house looking for clues of what she could find to take to the police. She told her about the days and the nights she spent searching for these clues, knowing that if it was up to him, Thuo would remain locked up for months, unable to speak up for himself. She explained that the only reason she left for Nakuru at the very last minute was because she didn't want to leave her husband rotting behind in a jail cell. Then she talked about all the violence and the killing in Nakuru, about the church burning in Eldoret. Everything that Kavata wanted to say felt inadequate because it was. Chepto's rage was very justified. Everything that she'd gone through and suffered through in the course of the past week was linked to Kavata's choice. She had put Thuo in that cell, and Chepto would never have been in Eldoret and by herself if Thuo was with her. She'd never have seen all those horrible things. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what else I can say, Chepto. I am so sorry. She continued chanting her apology, and Chepto just looked at her. It was never my intention, Chepto. Of course you can say that. Of course you can say that it wasn't your intention, but it's your fault. And for me, there's no difference between those two. I understand your anger, Chepto. Don't say that you understand my anger. You never will. You know, Mama Wanja, I've always admired you. Even before we met, when Thuo was working for your parents, I thought it was so nice that you were determined not to take after your father. I was so happy when Thuo told me that you took a job teaching. I thought it must be nice to work just because you want to, but not because you have to. I can tell you today, Kavata, you're nothing like your father. The words brought Kavata some brief respite. You are not like him, but you're also not better than him. Muli is aware of his power. He knows how to use it. He knows its danger, but you don't. You don't understand that every single thing you do affects us small people. Please don't call yourself small, Chepto. There's nothing small. Chepto rolled her eyes. But we are. We are the small people because we are always the ones who are shifting our lives around so that yours can stay the same. When you tell Thuo to work late, it means that we don't get to eat on time or at all because he always brings home our dinner. When you tell him to lie to your husband about where you are, and I'm sorry, I don't care why you did it, Thuo will do it, even if it means that he sits in a jail cell for a few days. And you don't know it because you never have to live with the consequences of your choices. Just like these politicians who will never suffer a day because of this election. Kuna watu na kuna viatu. Stop denying that to yourself. Chepto stopped talking and waited for a response, but Kavata didn't have one. It was a truth she had never considered. She hung her head in shame. Chepto softened her voice. Kavata, I know you don't think about these things, and I know you're a good person, but you must open your eyes. You and I were not the same, and to think that we are is stupid. Kenya has its owners, and you are one of them. Thank you. My name is Koinange. I am the author of The Havoc of Choice, now available everywhere.
You have just got to get her book and read it. What an exciting novel it is. Well, this is where we have to draw curtains on the show. As always, we'll be delighted to get your feedback through any of our social media platforms displayed on your screen. As we move into 2023, please keep them coming. We will respond to as many as possible, as quickly as possible. You can count on us for that. My name is Olakunle Kasumo. Remember, one great book can change your life. Bye-bye.